The transport vehicle shuddered to its final halt on that mid-September afternoon in 1945, somewhere deep in the Indiana countryside where the autumn air already carried hints of the coming cold. Through the narrow gaps between the wooden planks that formed their mobile prison, Ingrid could hear American voices barking commands in that harsh, unfamiliar language that had become the soundtrack of defeat. She pressed her face closer to the splintered wood, trying to catch a glimpse of what awaited them beyond these walls. What she saw made her stomach tighten with unease. The compound sprawled before them like some kind of theatrical set designed to deceive. Guard towers rose at regular intervals around the perimeter, yes, but they seemed almost ornamental rather than menacing. The fencing looked sturdy enough, yet it lacked the vicious appearance of the barriers she had grown accustomed to seeing. The buildings stood in neat rows, their exteriors maintained with a precision that spoke of resources and care. Nothing about the scene matched the warnings she had carried with her through 3 different prison camps. Where were the signs of systematic brutality? Where were the emaciated figures shuffling between buildings under the watchful eyes of cruel guards? Where was the atmosphere of barely contained violence that had characterized every other place of captivity she had experienced? Inside the truck's fetid darkness, Ingrid turned to face the 2 women who had become her companions through this latest journey into uncertainty. Her voice dropped to barely more than a whisper, each word carefully chosen to convey the weight of experience without crushing what little spirit they had left. "They will try to break us down gradually," she told them, her tone carrying the authority of someone who had commanded medical personnel under fire, who had made life-and-death decisions when there was no time for doubt. "They will ask questions that seem innocent at first. They will offer small comforts that cost them nothing but might cost us everything if we accept them too readily. Trust nothing that seems too good to be real, because in my experience it usually is exactly that. Too good to be real." Greta huddled against the truck's wall, her fingers wrapped protectively around the small photograph she had managed to conceal through countless searches and confiscations. The image showed her family as they had been before the world fell apart, smiling faces captured in a moment when the future still held promise rather than dread. Her hair, once the colour of summer wheat, now hung in matted tangles around a face made gaunt by months of inadequate nutrition and constant fear. "What happens when they search us this time?" she asked, her voice trembling with the knowledge that each new camp brought fresh indignities, new violations of whatever privacy or dignity prisoners thought they might still possess. Ingrid met her eyes with the kind of unflinching honesty that had served her well through years of impossible choices. "They will search us thoroughly," she said simply. "They always do. There is no point in pretending otherwise or hoping for some miraculous exception to the pattern. The Americans may present themselves differently than the Soviets, but underneath the surface courtesies, they are still victors dealing with the vanquished. We would do well to remember that distinction at all times." The 3rd woman in their small group, Anna, remained perfectly motionless as boots crunched on gravel outside their wooden cage. At 38, she had already lived through more variations of hell than most people could imagine in their darkest nightmares. Stalingrad had taught her about the extremes of human endurance. The desperate retreat through Poland had shown her what happened when military order collapsed into chaos. 2 separate Soviet prison camps had refined her understanding of survival down to its most essential elements. She no longer wasted energy on fear or hope or any of the other emotions that drained strength without providing tangible benefit. Her eyes held that peculiar flatness that came from witnessing too much suffering, from making peace with the possibility that any given day might be her last. She sat completely still, conserving energy, as male voices outside shouted instructions in their incomprehensible language. The truck doors burst open with a sound like a shotgun blast in the confined space, and suddenly autumn sunlight was flooding into their darkness with an intensity that made all 3 women squint and turn away. Ingrid forced herself to look up despite the discomfort, her body tensing in preparation for what came next. She knew this routine by heart. The shouting would start first, loud enough to disorient and intimidate. Then would come the rough hands pulling them from the truck, caring nothing for bruises or twisted limbs. Guards would push them into lines, strip-search them with casual brutality, inventory their few remaining possessions, and assign them to whatever labour or living quarters the camp administration had deemed appropriate for enemy prisoners. Except none of that happened. Instead, Ingrid found herself looking into the face of a young American soldier whose expression held something she had not seen directed at a German prisoner in longer than she could remember. Professional courtesy. Simple human decency. His eyes met hers without contempt or cruelty, without the kind of dehumanizing indifference that guards typically cultivated as protection against seeing prisoners as actual people. He stepped back slightly, giving them space rather than crowding them, and called out something in English that sounded more like an invitation than a command. Another figure appeared beside him, this one wearing an officer's uniform that identified her as female personnel, Captain Mitchell, according to the insignia visible on her collar and the nameplate affixed to her chest. She stood with the posture of someone accustomed to authority, but without the aggressive stance that many officers adopted when dealing with prisoners. She turned and spoke to someone behind her, and moments later a middle-aged man in civilian clothes approached with an expression that suggested concern rather than hostility. "My name is Klaus Weber," the man said in German, his accent carrying the familiar rhythms of Bavaria, of home, of a world that seemed to exist only in memory now. "I serve as translator for the American personnel here. Captain Mitchell has asked me to convey her welcome and to inform you that you are now under the protection of the United States Army. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention regarding prisoners of war. Your rights will be respected and your basic needs will be met." Ingrid felt her jaw muscles clench involuntarily at these words. The Geneva Convention. As if international treaties and carefully worded agreements meant anything at all when the victors held absolute power over the defeated. She had heard similar speeches before, delivered in different languages by officers wearing different uniforms, but the fundamental lie remained the same. They would promise humane treatment while photographs were being taken or observers were present, then revert to the familiar patterns of casual cruelty once the official scrutiny had moved elsewhere. Words were cheap. Actions were what mattered, and in her experience, the actions of captors toward their prisoners rarely matched the lofty rhetoric of international law. Captain Mitchell took a step forward, and in a gesture that seemed to surprise even Klaus the translator, she extended her hand toward Greta to help her down from the truck. It was such a simple action, the kind of basic courtesy that people offered each other in normal times, in civilized society, in a world where women were not divided into conquerors and conquered. But in this context, after everything they had endured, the gesture felt almost surreal. Greta recoiled instinctively, pressing herself back against the truck's interior as if the offered assistance might be some kind of trap. Captain Mitchell did not react with anger or impatience. She simply waited, her hand still extended, her expression patient and understanding. No sharp words, no threats, no demonstration of the power imbalance that existed between them. Just waiting, as if she had all the time in the world, as if helping a frightened prisoner down from a truck was the most natural thing imaginable. Klaus continued translating as the captain spoke again. "You will undergo processing first," he explained. "This will include medical examinations to assess your health and identify any immediate needs. You will receive clean clothing appropriate to the season. Following processing, you will be assigned to living quarters. You will have access to mail privileges, allowing you to send and receive correspondence with family members. Medical care will be available as needed. Work assignments will be provided, and these assignments will include small wages that you may use to purchase additional items from the camp commissary. Captain Mitchell wants you to understand that while you are indeed prisoners of war and certain restrictions on your freedom are necessary, you will be treated with the dignity that international law requires and that simple human decency demands." The words washed over Ingrid like some kind of familiar poison disguised in prettier packaging. She had heard variations of this speech so many times now that she could almost recite it from memory. The Soviets had been more direct in their approach, more honest about the brutality that awaited prisoners under their control, but these Americans seemed to take genuine pleasure in the elaborate pretense. They constructed beautiful lies about respect and dignity, building up hope in their prisoners before the inevitable disappointment crashed down like a physical blow. It was, in some ways, crueler than simple, direct violence. Ingrid climbed down from the truck under her own power, refusing the assistance that Captain Mitchell continued to offer. She would not give them the satisfaction of thinking their theatrical kindness had won her over. Anna followed her example, moving with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had long since stopped investing emotional energy in the transitions between different forms of captivity. But Greta remained frozen at the truck's edge, her wide eyes taking in the scene before them, with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and desperate hope. The camp bore no resemblance whatsoever to the nightmares they had been warned to expect. Clean pathways, carefully maintained, stretched between buildings that looked recently painted and structurally sound. Garden plots lined several of the structures, and even this late in the growing season, vegetables were visible among the carefully tended rows. In the distance, Greta could see other women, presumably fellow prisoners, moving between buildings with a freedom of movement that seemed impossible. Some carried books. Others walked in pairs or small groups, engaged in animated conversations that suggested they felt safe enough to lower their guard. The entire scene looked more like some kind of educational institution or sanitarium than a prison camp designed to house enemy nationals. But it was the scent that nearly undid Greta completely, nearly sent her to her knees right there in front of everyone. Drifting on the September breeze, carried from what must be bathing facilities somewhere in the compound, came the unmistakable fragrance of real soap. Not the harsh, burning lye mixture that passed for cleaning agents in most prison camps. Not the industrial chemicals that stripped skin of its natural oils and left prisoners feeling raw and damaged. But actual soap, the kind that suggested hot water and genuine bathing and the possibility of feeling clean again in a way that went beyond mere physical hygiene. "This cannot be real," Ingrid murmured, more to herself than to her companions. "It has to be some kind of elaborate trick, some new form of psychological torture designed to break us down in ways that physical cruelty never could. They show us comfort and safety and basic human decency, let us begin to believe in these things, and then they snatch it all away and watch us shatter from the disappointment." But even as she spoke these words, she could hear the uncertainty creeping into her voice, the tiny crack in her armour of cynical expectation. 3 weeks passed, measured not in the brutal sameness that had characterized time in other camps, but in small daily discoveries that challenged everything Ingrid thought she knew about captivity. She found herself standing in the camp infirmary one afternoon, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of her former profession as she cleaned and sutured a gash on the arm of a fellow prisoner who had stumbled during kitchen duty. The familiar rhythm of medical work felt like returning to a half-remembered dream, the careful assessment of wounds, the precise application of sutures, the quiet satisfaction that came from healing rather than merely witnessing deterioration and death. Dr. Patterson, the American physician who served as the camp's chief medical officer, watched from across the room as Ingrid worked. She had been skeptical when Captain Mitchell first suggested allowing a former German field surgeon to assist in the medical facility. The idea of trusting an enemy prisoner with access to medical supplies and vulnerable patients had seemed reckless at best, potentially dangerous at worst. But 3 weeks of observation had transformed skepticism into something approaching professional respect. Ingrid's hands remembered skills that transcended national boundaries and political allegiances. Her gentle manner with frightened patients spoke of someone who understood suffering on a level that went beyond theoretical knowledge or clinical training. "You do excellent work," Dr. Patterson said in her limited but carefully practiced German, and Ingrid felt something inside her chest shift in a way that felt both painful and liberating. A crack appeared in the protective shell she had built around herself, not breaking open completely, but softening in a manner that felt dangerous because it made her vulnerable to disappointment. She had prepared herself for many possible scenarios in this American camp, but not for this. Not for professional respect that acknowledged her skills and experience. Not for the gradual restoration of an identity she had believed the war had stripped away permanently. In another part of the camp, in the building that had been converted into a makeshift classroom, Greta bent over a piece of paper with intense concentration. Her tongue caught between her teeth in the unconscious gesture of someone focusing all their mental energy on a challenging task. She struggled to form English letters that still felt foreign and awkward despite weeks of practice. The young American guard who had volunteered to teach basic English during his off-duty hours sat patiently beside her. Tommy, he had told them to call him, dropping the formality of rank in these informal educational sessions. He pointed to pictures in a children's primer he had brought from the nearby town. "Farm," he said slowly, tapping his finger on a drawing of a red barn surrounded by fields. "Farm, like what my family has back in Ohio. Can you say that?" "Farm?" Greta repeated the word carefully, her German accent transforming the simple English syllable into something that sounded simultaneously familiar and strange. "Farm. Like this? Farm?" Tommy grinned with the kind of uncomplicated pleasure that came from watching someone succeed at a difficult task. "Yeah, exactly like that. You're getting really good at this, Greta." He pulled his wallet from his back pocket and extracted a creased photograph that had obviously been handled many times. His parents stood on a modest farmhouse porch, waving at whoever was taking the picture. Their faces held the kind of weathered contentment that came from lives built on honest labour and family connection. "See? That's my folks. That's the farm I grew up on." Greta studied the photograph with fascination that went beyond mere curiosity about her teacher's background. These were the faces of the enemy, the people she had been taught to fear and hate, the Americans who were supposed to be savage barbarians bent on the destruction of everything civilized and good. But in this photograph, they looked exactly like any German farming couple she might have known before the war, weathered by sun and work, softened by years of marriage and family life, completely ordinary, completely human. "Your farm is big?" she asked, her limited English making the question simpler than she would have preferred. Tommy shook his head with a self-deprecating smile. "Not so big," he admitted. "But it's home, you know? Someday, when all this war business is finally finished and done with, I'm going back there to help my dad with the harvest." He paused, studying her face with the kind of genuine interest that suggested he saw her as a person rather than merely a prisoner. "Do you have family? A farm, maybe?" Greta's hand moved instinctively toward the hidden photograph she kept pressed against her chest beneath her clothing. The family portrait had become more than just a picture. It was proof that she had once belonged somewhere, that she had once been part of something larger than herself, that a world had existed before the war reduced everything to survival and fear. But even after weeks of English lessons and chocolate bars from the commissary and Tommy's unfailing patience with her halting attempts at his language, trust remained a luxury she could not quite afford. She stopped her hand before it reached the photograph and simply shook her head without elaborating. From her office window, Captain Mitchell observed the daily routines of camp life unfolding with a satisfaction tempered by awareness of how fragile this entire experiment truly was. The integration of German prisoners into productive camp life was proceeding better than she had allowed herself to hope in those early days of uncertainty and institutional resistance. Work assignments had been distributed based on individual skills and abilities rather than as punishment or mere busy work. Women who had been teachers before the war found themselves helping in the camp school where they taught literacy classes to American personnel who wanted to improve their limited education. Those with sewing and mending skills worked in the uniform repair facility where their knowledge of making clothing last longer proved invaluable. Women who knew how to cook found themselves welcomed in the mess kitchens, where their ability to create filling meals from limited ingredients was genuinely appreciated rather than exploited. But Captain Mitchell's satisfaction remained incomplete because she was intelligent enough to recognize the growing pressure from higher authority. Colonel Harrison's visits had become more frequent as the weeks passed. His questions had grown more pointed. His patience with what he clearly viewed as excessive softness toward enemy prisoners had worn increasingly thin. He wanted intelligence, actionable information about rocket programs and weapons development and factory locations, and anything else that might prove useful to the ongoing campaign in the Pacific Theater. He could not seem to understand why Captain Mitchell's approach of treating prisoners with basic human decency had not somehow magically produced a flood of strategic intelligence. These women are not strategic assets, she had argued during their most recent confrontation. They are not rocket scientists or military planners or anyone with access to the kind of information you seem to think they possess. They are teachers and nurses and farm wives and librarians who had the misfortune of being on the losing side of history. Colonel Harrison had responded with the cold certainty of someone who viewed all Germans as potentially valuable sources of information, regardless of their actual background or knowledge. Every German knows something useful, he had insisted. Every person who lived under that madman's regime must have seen something, heard something, learned something that could help us. Your job, Captain, is to find out what that something is and extract it for use by our intelligence services. The Colonel's words echoed in Mitchell's mind now as she watched Anna working in the camp garden. The older woman moved with methodical efficiency as she harvested the last of the season's tomatoes, placing each one carefully in the basket at her feet. Of all the German women in her charge, Anna remained the most closed off, the most resistant to the carefully constructed atmosphere of cautious trust. She performed her assigned duties without complaint or resistance, but she offered nothing beyond what was strictly required. No conversations beyond what was necessary, no personal information, no indication that she viewed her American captors as anything other than temporary masters who might turn cruel at any moment. Mitchell sensed that Anna held some kind of key to understanding whether their experimental approach to prisoner treatment was genuinely working, or whether they had merely created an elaborate facade that hid unchanged fear and resentment beneath a surface of sullen cooperation. That evening in the dining hall, something unprecedented occurred. The sound began at one of the tables where a group of German women sat with their evening meal. A soft chuckle, barely audible above the normal sounds of cutlery against plates and multiple conversations happening simultaneously. Then another woman added her voice to the first, and within moments an entire table was sharing what appeared to be some kind of joke, their faces animated in ways that spoke of returning humanity, of people beginning to remember that joy and humour remained possible even in circumstances of captivity. The American guards noticed immediately. Several paused in their duties, struck by the simple novelty of hearing genuine German laughter within the walls of their prison camp. It was not the bitter, edge-of-hysteria laughter they sometimes heard from prisoners who had been pushed beyond normal limits of endurance. Not the dark humour that served as armour against unbearable reality. But actual cleansing laughter of the sort that indicated people were beginning to remember that happiness was possible, that not every moment had to be shadowed by fear and despair. Ingrid sat somewhat apart from the laughing group, watching this small miracle unfold with deeply conflicted emotions. Part of her desperately wanted to join them, to surrender to the seductive comfort of believing that perhaps these Americans truly meant what they said about dignity and Geneva Convention protections and treating prisoners as human beings deserving of basic respect. But another part of her, the part that had learned survival through years of expecting the worst from every situation, whispered constant warnings about the dangers of hope deferred and disappointment delayed but inevitable. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early October, carried in the regular mail delivery that had become one of the camp's most anticipated daily rituals. Ingrid's hands began trembling the moment she recognized her eldest son's careful handwriting on the envelope. Heinrich. who would be 15 years old now, assuming he had survived the final chaotic months of the war and its immediate aftermath. She had not allowed herself to hope for any word from her children, had convinced herself through months of silence that they were likely dead or scattered beyond any possibility of finding them again. Klaus Weber sat quietly beside her in the small room that had been designated for private mail reading. His presence served as a reminder that even this most personal of moments remained subject to official scrutiny and oversight. But his face held no trace of judgment or intrusive curiosity as Ingrid's tears began to fall, and when she looked up at him with desperate gratitude that she could not begin to put into words, he simply nodded and turned his gaze toward the window to provide what privacy he could within the constraints of his responsibilities. Heinrich's letter explained that he and his younger brother were safe, living with their grandmother in a small village outside Munich that had somehow escaped the worst of the final bombing campaigns. American forces had arrived in their area bringing food and medical supplies rather than the vengeance that everyone had been taught to expect and fear. "We have enough to eat now," her son had written in the careful script she had taught him during those peaceful years that seemed like someone else's lifetime. "The Americans ask about you sometimes. They say that prisoners of war are being treated well. I hope with all my heart that this is true, Mama. We pray for you every single night before we sleep." Across the compound in the classroom building, Greta experienced her own small triumph that same afternoon. Tommy had brought her another book, this one a simple reader about American customs and daily life. For the first time since beginning these lessons, she managed to read an entire paragraph aloud without stumbling over unfamiliar words or becoming confused by the strange rules of English pronunciation. Her accent remained heavy, thick with the German sounds that her mouth and tongue wanted to default to, but the meaning came through clearly enough. Tommy's proud grin made something flutter in her chest that she had not felt since before the world went mad, something that felt dangerously close to happiness. "You're getting really good at this," he said with genuine enthusiasm. Then he paused, as if considering whether to cross some invisible boundary that had existed between them up until this moment. "Greta, can I ask you something? Something kind of personal?" She looked at him with surprise that must have shown clearly on her face. In all their weeks of lessons together, sharing chocolate and stumbling through vocabulary exercises, he had never asked personal questions. He had never pushed beyond the careful boundaries of grammar instruction and pronunciation practice. But something in his expression suggested this was different, not the calculated probing of someone fishing for intelligence, but the genuine curiosity of a person trying to understand a world that circumstances had transformed into an enemy. "What was it like?" he asked. "In Germany, I mean, before everything went completely crazy. What was your life like before the war?" She stared at him for a long moment, trying to find English words adequate to describe the Germany of her childhood and youth. "Beautiful," she began, then stopped, frustrated by the limitations of her vocabulary. "My family, we had small bakery. Every morning, the smell of bread, of fresh baking." She closed her eyes, letting memory carry her backward through time and trauma. People were happy then, before everything changed so much. Tommy nodded slowly, his farm boy face serious with thought. "My dad always said that regular folks are mostly the same everywhere in the world," he offered. "It's just the leaders who make all the trouble, who get people fighting and hating each other. Most people just want to live their lives in peace." Even as these small connections formed and strengthened, even as trust began to develop in careful increments between captors and captives, darker currents were gathering strength beneath the surface calm. Colonel Harrison arrived one morning with a larger entourage than usual, bringing military intelligence officers whose cold eyes swept across the camp with calculating assessment. Captain Mitchell met them at the main gate, her spine held rigidly straight and her expression carefully neutral, but Ingrid noticed the subtle tension visible in her shoulders as she escorted the visitors toward the administration building. The change in atmosphere was immediate and impossible to miss. Guards who had grown relaxed in their duties over weeks of peaceful routine suddenly snapped to rigid attention. The easy conversations that had developed between American personnel and German prisoners became stilted and formal, weighted with awareness that they were being observed and evaluated. Even Tommy seemed different during that afternoon's English lesson, glancing nervously toward the windows as if expecting to be called out and reprimanded for fraternizing too freely with the enemy. Anna, working in the camp library where she had been helping to catalogue and repair damaged books, paused in her careful work as raised voices drifted from the direction of Captain Mitchell's office. The words themselves were muffled by distance and intervening walls, but the tone was unmistakably confrontational. She set down her pen and listened more intently, her expression growing troubled as she caught fragments of conversation that seemed to centre around results and wasted opportunities and soft approaches that were yielding nothing of value. That evening, the atmosphere in the dining hall felt fundamentally different from the easy camaraderie that had been developing over recent weeks. Conversations became more subdued, more careful. Several women kept glancing toward the administration building where lights burned late into the night. Even the guards seemed on edge, their usual casual friendliness replaced by a watchful formality that reminded everyone present that this place was, after all, a prison camp housing enemy nationals during a time of war. Ingrid sat with her letter from Heinrich, reading it for perhaps the fourth or fifth time that day, when she noticed silence spreading through the hall like ripples moving outward on still water. Following the direction of other women's gazes, she looked up to see Colonel Harrison entering with his escort of intelligence officers. His eyes swept the room with calculating coldness, and when his gaze fell on groups of German women sitting together in apparent comfort, his expression hardened with obvious disapproval. Captain Mitchell followed behind him, her face carefully composed, but her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. She caught Ingrid's eye for just a brief moment, and in that fleeting exchange, Ingrid read something that made her stomach clench with dread. An apology offered in advance for whatever was about to happen. The Colonel's voice carried clearly across the dining hall as he spoke to Captain Mitchell, making no attempt whatsoever to lower his tone or conceal his words from the prisoners who were obviously listening. "This all looks very cosy, Captain. Very comfortable. But comfort is not why these women are here. Tomorrow morning, we begin implementing a different approach, one that might actually produce some useful intelligence for a change." As the Colonel and his officers filed out, leaving behind a room full of frightened faces and anxious whispers, Ingrid carefully folded her son's letter and tucked it against her heart. Whatever storm was coming, she would need every possible source of strength to weather it. The security breach was discovered at dawn on a grey Thursday morning when Sergeant Williams reported that classified documents detailing troop movements in the Pacific Theatre had vanished from the administration building's filing system. Within a matter of hours, Camp Blackwater transformed from a place of cautious hope and careful trust-building into something that felt sickeningly familiar to every German woman who had learned to recognize the warning signs of impending catastrophe. The lockdown order came with swift and merciless efficiency. No more male privileges connecting prisoners to the outside world and the families they might never see again. No more work assignments outside the barracks that provided purpose and structure to their days. No more English lessons or garden duties or any of the small freedoms that had begun to feel like stepping stones on a path back towards something resembling normal humanity. Guards who had learned to address the women by name suddenly became anonymous faces behind rifles. The easy conversations that had developed over weeks of patient effort evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. Ingrid found herself confined to quarters with 15 other women, the clean sheets and comfortable beds suddenly feeling like stage props in some elaborate theatrical production designed to deceive. Through the barracks window, she could see Captain Mitchell pacing the compound alongside Colonel Harrison, her shoulders rigid with what looked like barely contained fury. Even at considerable distance, it was clear that whatever conversation was taking place between them was not going in the captain's favour. "I told you this would happen," Greta whispered from her bunk, her voice carrying none of the triumph that such words might normally contain. Instead, she sounded hollow, defeated, like someone watching a long-dreaded prediction prove accurate despite desperate hopes to the contrary. The kindness was all a lie. The respect, the promises about Geneva Convention protections, the talk about human dignity. All of it was just another kind of torture, another way to break us down psychologically. The individual interrogations began that same afternoon, conducted with systematic efficiency that suggested careful planning. Women were called out one by one, escorted by armed guards to the administration building where intelligence officers waited with clipboards and prepared questions. Those who returned from these sessions came back visibly shaken, their eyes holding that familiar glaze that came from being systematically dismantled and found wanting. Anna was among the first to be questioned. She sat across a desk from a major whose nameplate identified him as Kellerman, whose pale eyes seemed to look through her rather than at her, as if she were merely an obstacle between him and the information he sought. He wanted to know about factories and weapons production and any technical knowledge she might possess. When she explained for the third time that she had been a librarian in a small Bavarian town, that her knowledge extended to cataloguing systems and children's literature, but decidedly not to military secrets or weapons development, his expression grew increasingly hostile. "Everyone knows something useful," he said, his words eerily echoing Colonel Harrison's earlier statements. "The question is whether you possess enough intelligence to share that information voluntarily, or whether we need to explore alternative methods of encouragement to help you remember things you claim to have forgotten." Ingrid's turn came 2 days later. She sat in that same chair facing similarly cold questions about rocket programs and weapons development, explaining with growing desperation that her medical training had nothing whatsoever to do with military technology or strategic intelligence. The officer conducting her interrogation, a different man this time, younger but seemingly no less ruthless in his approach, appeared particularly interested in her work in the camp infirmary. He suggested that her access to medical supplies and personnel files made her a potentially valuable intelligence asset, regardless of her claimed ignorance about military matters. "Dr. Patterson trusts you," he said, leaning back in his chair with an expression of calculation. "She discusses medical cases with you, shares information about camp operations and personnel. Surely someone in your position has overheard useful conversations, has observed interesting patterns in how this facility operates." The implication hung in the air between them like poison gas slowly filling a closed room. They wanted her to betray the woman who had treated her as a professional colleague, who had helped restore some measure of her dignity and self-worth. They wanted her to repay kindness with treachery, to prove that every stereotype about German duplicity and untrustworthiness was justified and accurate. Meanwhile, Captain Mitchell found herself fighting a different kind of battle within the confines of her own office. Colonel Harrison had made his position brutally clear through words that left no room for misunderstanding or negotiation. Either she produced actionable intelligence from her prisoners within 1 week's time, or she would face a court-martial for dereliction of duty and failure to fulfill her responsibilities. The camp would be transferred to more aggressive leadership, and this entire experimental approach to prisoner treatment would be terminated permanently and cited as an example of why softness toward enemies was both foolish and counterproductive. "These women are not strategic assets," she argued again, but her protests sounded weaker now, undermined by the missing documents that had triggered this entire crisis. "They are civilians who got caught up in forces and events far larger than themselves. They have no access to the kind of information you seem convinced they possess." "Sentiment is a luxury we cannot afford during wartime," Harrison replied with cold certainty. "The war in the Pacific continues to cost American lives with every passing day. If these prisoners possess any information whatsoever that could potentially save even one of our boys, then extracting that information becomes a moral imperative that supersedes your concerns about their comfort or dignity." The change in daily routine was comprehensive and deliberately designed to break down whatever trust had been built over previous weeks. The hot meals that had become a symbol of American plenty and a stark contrast to the meagre rations in Soviet camps were replaced with cold rations barely adequate to sustain life. The medical supplies that had allowed Ingrid to practice her profession and feel like a competent human being rather than just a prisoner were locked away under armed guard. The books and writing materials that had given women hope of maintaining their intellectual lives disappeared overnight as if they had never existed. Most devastating of all was the restoration of institutional cruelty in small everyday interactions that ground away at dignity more effectively than grand gestures of brutality ever could. Guards who had learned to say please and thank you reverted to barked orders delivered in tones of contempt. The clean towels that had made bathing feel like an act of restoration rather than mere functional hygiene vanished, replaced by rough cloth that abraded skin already made sensitive by weeks of proper care. The scent of real soap faded from the barracks, replaced once again by the familiar institutional smell of harsh disinfectant and accumulated despair. Greta sat on her bunk that evening staring at the blank wall where a small mirror had hung until the new security measures removed it, along with other privileges. She pulled the hidden family photograph from its concealment and studied the faces of parents and siblings she might never see again outside the confines of this fragile paper. For a brief, shining moment, she had allowed herself to believe that dignity might be possible even in captivity, that enemies might choose mercy over vengeance, that the better angels of human nature might sometimes prevail over the worst impulses of war and hatred. Now that hope felt like the cruelest joke of all, more painful than simple direct brutality would have been. The truth emerged on a rain-soaked Monday morning when Private Johnson discovered the missing classified documents wedged behind a filing cabinet in the records room. They had apparently slipped from an overstuffed folder during routine filing approximately 3 weeks earlier. No German prisoner had been involved in any way. No security breach had actually occurred. No espionage or information theft had taken place. The entire crisis that had transformed Camp Blackwater back into a place of fear and suspicion had been built on nothing more substantial than a clerical error and one young soldier's understandable reluctance to admit he might have misfiled important papers. Captain Mitchell stood in Colonel Harrison's temporary office holding the recovered documents while rain drummed steadily against the windows like countless small accusations. The intelligence officers who had spent days interrogating terrified women about non-existent secrets packed their briefcases with expressions of professional disappointment rather than relief or apology. Their methods had yielded nothing because there had been nothing whatsoever to yield, but this fact seemed to trouble them far less than it should have. "Well," Harrison said with the casual indifference of someone whose career prospects would remain completely unaffected by the week's revelations, "at least we know the security protocols function properly when they need to be implemented. Better safe than sorry in matters of potential intelligence compromise." He paused at the door, his cold eyes surveying the rain-soaked compound one final time before departure. Keep them on restricted privileges for another week or so, just to maintain proper discipline. Cannot have them thinking this was all some kind of regrettable mistake. But it had been a mistake. A catastrophic, trust-destroying mistake that had revealed just how fragile their experiment in dignified treatment truly was. How quickly institutional paranoia could overwhelm individual compassion. How easily fear could trump decency when pressure came from higher authority. Captain Mitchell watched the colonel's convoy disappear into the October gloom and felt the crushing weight of responsibility for 27 frightened women whose faith in American promises had been shattered through no fault of their own. In the barracks, silence had become the dominant mode of communication. Women who had begun tentatively sharing stories of home and hope now sat on their bunks, staring at walls, their faces holding that flat expression of people who had learned through bitter experience not to invest emotional energy in anything that could be arbitrarily taken away without warning or justification. Greta clutched her hidden family photograph, but no longer dared to look at it, afraid that even this small private comfort might somehow be discovered and confiscated by guards looking for any excuse to demonstrate their authority. The oppressive quiet was finally broken by Anna, whose voice cut through the silence with devastating clarity, born of years of accumulated suffering and disillusionment. "They cleared us," she said to no one in particular, her words directed at the empty air rather than any specific listener. The missing papers were found exactly where some careless American had left them. We did absolutely nothing wrong. She looked around the barracks at faces that had stopped believing vindication would make any practical difference to their circumstances. And yet here we still are, still locked up, still being punished for crimes we did not commit. This is what American justice looks like when nobody important is watching. Ingrid sat on the edge of her bunk, reading her son's letter for what felt like the 100th time, the paper growing soft and fragile with repeated handling. Heinrich's words about Americans bringing food and medical supplies instead of expected vengeance seemed to mock her current circumstances with cruel irony. Perhaps her son was encountering a different kind of American than the ones who administered prison camps. Perhaps kindness was reserved exclusively for conquered civilians, while cruelty remained the default approach to captured enemies. Perhaps she had been desperately foolish to think that mercy could somehow survive intact within the grinding machinery of institutional warfare. But that same afternoon, something wholly unexpected happened that challenged every assumption she had built up as protective armor against disappointment. Captain Mitchell appeared in the doorway of their barracks, not with the stiff official bearing she had maintained throughout the crisis, but with the hesitant, uncertain posture of someone approaching a wounded animal that might either attack or flee at any sudden movement. In her hands, she carried something small and immediately recognizable. Greta's confiscated family photograph, the precious image that had been taken during the initial security sweep. She walked directly to Greta's bunk and held out the photograph without preamble or elaborate explanation. "I am sorry," she said in carefully pronounced German that she must have practiced extensively with Klaus Weber's patient assistants. "We allowed fear to win. We forgot who we are supposed to be." Greta stared at the offered photograph for what felt like an eternity, almost afraid to reach for it, terrified it might somehow disappear or prove to be another cruel trick if she moved too quickly or showed too much eagerness. When she finally took the photograph, her hands were shaking so violently that the beloved image blurred through sudden tears that she could not control or contain. "You were afraid," Greta said quietly after a long moment, studying Captain Mitchell's face with dawning understanding. The words were not an accusation, but rather a recognition, one survivor acknowledging another person's struggle against forces beyond individual control or resistance. Mitchell nodded, her own eyes bright with unshed tears that spoke of her own battles and compromises. "Fear makes cowards of all of us," she replied through Klaus's gentle translation. "But that does not excuse what happened here. It does not justify what we took from you, the trust we violated, the promises we broke." She paused, looking around the barracks at faces that were beginning to show the faintest glimmers of cautious hope fighting against ingrained despair. "I cannot undo what happened, but I can promise you this, not on my watch, not again, not to any of you." As Captain Mitchell departed, promising hot baths and clean towels by evening as a first step toward rebuilding what had been damaged, Greta held her family photograph up to the grey afternoon light streaming through the barracks windows. The faces of her parents and siblings looked back at her with expressions frozen in happier times, captured before war had taught everyone that kindness was a dangerous luxury and trust a potentially fatal vulnerability. But perhaps, she thought as steam began rising visibly from the restored bathhouse across the compound, real courage was not the complete absence of fear, but rather the conscious decision to choose mercy and compassion despite that fear. Perhaps genuine dignity was not something that could be given by others or taken away by circumstances, but something that lived in the contested space between people who decided, against all evidence and reason, to see each other as human beings fundamentally worthy of respect and basic decency, regardless of which uniform they wore or which side of history they found themselves occupying. The photograph trembled in her hands like something alive, fragile as hope itself. But for the first time in more weeks than she could accurately count, it felt less like an object of mourning for an irretrievable past, and more like a promise that perhaps, despite everything, despite all the fear and cruelty and institutional madness of war, the possibility of human connection and mutual understanding had not been completely destroyed. The steam from the bathhouse carried with it that clean soap scent again, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the tentative sound of women beginning to speak to each other once more, their voices carrying the careful optimism of people daring to hope that this time, maybe this time, the promises might actually mean something real and lasting.